Earth, Wind, and Fire once looked unstoppable. Giant afros, glittering costumes, and September, shaking every dance floor. Then Maurice White lost the stage to Parkinson's. Verdine White was suddenly forced to step away. And at 78, McKay did something few fans ever expected. 50 years ago, no one could have imagined how differently their lives would turn out. What really became of Earth, Wind, and Fire in 2026? Let's find out. First, let's look at one of the familiar faces still carrying that music today, Philip Bailey. Back in 1972, Bailey was just 21 when he joined Earth, Wind, and Fire. Thin, bespectacled, and wearing the huge afro that defined the early 1970s, he sang while also playing percussion. But what truly set Bailey apart was his remarkable falsetto, which would later turn Reasons into one of Earth, Wind, and Fire's most unforgettable performances. More than half a century later, Bailey is 75. That enormous afro is long gone. His hair is now closely cropped, his beard has turned almost completely gray, and the once lean, angular face has become fuller with age. The lines around his eyes are easy to see whenever he smiles. He still wears glasses from time to time, but the flamboyant stage clothes of his youth have largely given way to the more refined appearance of a man well into his 70s. Bailey himself has mellowed with age as well. In his younger years, audiences knew him for those astonishing high notes and the energy he brought to the stage. Today, he speaks much more about gratitude, faith, family, and the people who helped him along the way. Faith, however, is not something Bailey discovered late in life. He grew up around church music, and gospel had a profound influence on the singer he eventually became. After decades of fame, awards, touring, and international success, that spiritual foundation remains an important part of who he is. His romantic life has been less straightforward than his career. Bailey went through 2 previous marriages before marrying Valerie Bailey in 2002. By 2026, the couple have been together for more than 2 decades. Valerie still accompanies her husband on important occasions. He is the father of several children, and music has found its way into the next generation. His daughter Trinity Bailey pursued singing, while Philip Bailey Jr. followed a path even closer to his father's, performing as a vocalist and percussionist. In June 2026, Bailey himself shared a photograph of the two of them on their way to New York for the Tribeca Festival. Bailey has long been associated with Los Angeles, where much of his adult life and music career have been based. But Denver, Colorado, remains an important part of his story. That was where he was born and raised, long before Maurice White's invitation changed the direction of his life. And this is where Philip Bailey's story in 2026 becomes truly remarkable. He still hasn't retired. After Maurice died in 2016, Bailey, Verdine White, and Ralph Johnson remained the 3 longtime veterans carrying the group's history forward. And Bailey is no longer doing it alone. Philip Bailey Jr. now performs with Earth, Wind, and Fire as part of the touring lineup, singing background vocals and playing percussion while his father remains one of the principal voices out front. What began as one man's career has quietly become a family legacy. That became especially meaningful in June 2026, when Bailey, Verdine, and Ralph appeared at New York's Beacon Theater during the Tribeca Festival for the premiere of Questlove's Earth, Wind, and Fire documentary. Robert De Niro was also present during the festival's opening night. Bailey was no longer the 21-year-old newcomer trying to establish himself in Maurice White's band. He was now one of the men being honored for having lived through its extraordinary history. Bailey himself seemed almost amazed by that longevity when he told people in 2024, "I don't think we could have dreamt that we were going to make 50 years in and be relevant in the culture." Perhaps even Bailey never imagined what 75 would look like. The afro is gone. His face has aged. And now, sometimes standing only a few feet away, is his own son. And behind Bailey's remarkable journey was the man who had seen something special in him more than half a century earlier, Maurice White. When Maurice founded Earth, Wind, and Fire in 1970, he was 28, lean and intense, with a thick beard, serious expression, colorful clothes, and that little kalimba longtime fans will remember in his hands. But Maurice wasn't simply the man standing out front. He was the drummer, songwriter, producer, arranger, and demanding musical mind who shaped what Earth, Wind, and Fire would eventually become. By 2015, however, the Maurice White that longtime fans remembered had almost completely disappeared from public view. At 73, Parkinson's disease gradually took much of that physical freedom away. The wild afro and thick beard of the 1970s were long gone. He wore his hair short, his face was fuller and visibly aged, with deeper lines across his forehead and around his eyes, but the familiar mustache and that serious, unmistakable gaze were still there. His bandmates had noticed signs years earlier. Philip Bailey later recalled that they could see something was wrong, and that it took Maurice considerable courage to finally acknowledge what he was facing. Maurice stopped regular touring in the mid-1990s, and although he still made occasional appearances afterward by his final years, he had largely retreated from public life. So by 2015 and early 2016, fans were no longer seeing new images of Maurice every few weeks. He was living quietly in Beverly Crest, Los Angeles, in the Tudor-style home he had purchased back in 1978 for about $340,000. Property records later confirmed that Maurice remained there until his death. The house stood in the gated Bel Air Ridge community, with 4 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, canyon views, and more than 4,100 square feet of living space. After decades spent traveling from city to city, this became the place where he spent the final stage of his life. His family life was equally private. Maurice was survived by his wife Marilyn and their 3 children, daughter Hemea, often called Mimi, and sons Cabron and Eden. Unlike many celebrities of his generation, Maurice rarely turned his marriage or children into material for interviews. By the final years of his life, that privacy had become even stronger. When he died, Verdine White specifically asked the public to respect the family's privacy during what he described as a very difficult and life-changing transition. Physically, the contrast with the Maurice of the 1970s was painful. But that did not mean Maurice had lost his mental faculties or spent those years completely incapacitated. In fact, one of the most revealing things about his personality comes from what he had said years earlier about Earth, Wind, and Fire. Maurice explained that his objective was to try to inspire young people to believe in themselves and to follow through on their ideas. Even after Parkinson's removed him from regular touring, that interest in what his music meant to other people remained part of his legacy. And this brings us to what Maurice was actually doing near the end. He retained executive involvement with the group and continued working in music after his touring years ended. The surviving band continued without him, while Maurice remained largely behind the scenes. Most importantly, near the end of his life, he turned his attention toward preserving his own story. Maurice worked with writer Herb Powell on his memoir, My Life with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Instead of allowing other people to explain how a session drummer from Chicago had built one of America's most successful bands, he helped put that history into his own account. The book was completed around the final period of his life and published later in 2016. That was effectively Maurice White's last major project. There would be no comeback tour. On February 4, 2016, Maurice died in his sleep at his Los Angeles home at the age of 74, after living with Parkinson's disease for many years. Verdine announced his brother's death with unusually personal words. My brother, hero, and best friend Maurice White passed away peacefully last night in his sleep. But he was spending his final period at the Los Angeles home he had owned for nearly 4 decades, surrounded by a much more private world of family. While completing the story of the extraordinary career, his body would no longer allow him to perform on stage. But Maurice's story did not end there. His younger brother Verdine was still out on the road, carrying the White family name and the music they had built together. Verdine White had joined Maurice in 1970 at only 19, a skinny young bassist with long, thick hair and seemingly endless energy. Verdine ran, jumped, spun, and leaned toward the audience, somehow never losing the groove. He didn't just play the bass. You could almost see the rhythm moving through him. That young man is now 75 years old, yet Verdine may be one of the easiest members of the classic lineup to recognize. He never abandoned the long hair that became part of his image. In recent years, he has worn it long, straight, and dark, falling well below his shoulders. His face has become noticeably thinner and more weathered, with deeper lines around his eyes and cheeks. Look closely at his hands and the years are there too, the prominent veins of a man who has spent more than half a century gripping the neck of a bass guitar. Even his clothes refuse to surrender completely to age. Verdine still favors glittering jackets, fitted trousers, jewelry, and the kind of stage wardrobe that would look excessive almost anywhere except an Earth, Wind, and Fire concert. But the greatest similarity is his personality. At 75, Verdine still seems almost incapable of standing quietly with a bass in his hands. His movements are naturally smaller than those of the young man who raced around stages in the 1970s, but the instinct remains. He rocks forward with the rhythm, walks toward the front of the stage, bends into his instrument, and smiles at the audience. There is something more personal behind that smile now. Verdine has been married to Shelley Clarke since 1980, giving him one of the longest marriages connected with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Shelley had already experienced fame herself as a member of Honeycomb, the R&B group remembered for the 1971 #1 hit, Want Ads. Their marriage has lasted more than 45 years, through Verdine's constant touring and the enormous changes surrounding the band. They have built a family away from the stage as well, and Verdine is now a grandfather. That makes the contrast particularly striking. The shirtless young bassist remembered by fans from old photographs is now a husband of more than 4 decades and a grandfather in his mid-70s. Family, however, has also become the most painful part of growing older. For Verdine, continuing Earth, Wind, and Fire. After that meant something very different from simply extending a successful career. The band had once given 3 White brothers a place in the same musical story. By 2026, Verdine was the only one of those brothers still alive. He has spoken about Maurice with enormous affection, rather than trying to separate himself from his older brother's shadow. He even recorded Superman as a tribute to Maurice, with Shelley involved as producer. The title itself reflected how Verdine regarded the brother who had first brought him into Earth, Wind, and Fire. That brings us to what his life actually looks like in 2026. During the first half of the year, Verdine was still traveling across America with Earth, Wind, and Fire on the Sing-a-Song all-night-long tour with Lionel Richie. More than 50 years after the band's peak, he was still spending nights beneath arena lights with a bass strapped across his body. At Pittsburgh's PPG Paints Arena on June 30th, he even stepped forward for a bass solo. Then came September, and the 75-year-old Verdine was once again playing a song he had helped make famous when many people in that audience were young. June brought another kind of appearance. Verdine joined Philip Bailey and Ralph Johnson at New York's Beacon Theater during the Tribeca Festival for the premiere of Questlove's Earth, Wind, and Fire documentary. This time, the 3 men were not simply performing their past, they were watching it become history. Then Verdine's body finally forced a temporary change of plans. On July 26, 2026, Verdine announced that he was stepping away from the stage temporarily while recovering from a recent medical procedure. Earth, Wind, and Fire would continue performing while he recovered. Verdine had always been the heartbeat you could see. but listen closely to those old records, and another part of that rhythm came from the guitar of McKay. McKay had already spent the late 1960s learning his craft on stage beside Tina Turner. By the time he joined Earth, Wind and Fire in 1973 at 25, he was slim and sharply dressed, with a huge afro and a left-handed guitar that made him easy to spot. His tight, percussive playing soon became an essential part of the sound longtime fans still recognize today. Jump ahead more than half a century and the contrast is impossible to miss. At 78, the enormous afro has disappeared. His hair and beard are now white, his face has filled out considerably, and his body carries the unmistakable weight of age. Put an old photograph beside a recent one and some casual fans might struggle to recognize him. Put a guitar in his hands, however, and the connection becomes much easier to hear. Unlike Johnny Graham, whose later life took him away from the international spotlight, McKay has spent his 70s traveling back toward the music of his youth. He leads the Earth, Wind and Fire Experience by McKay, a large live ensemble built around the songs and rhythmic style he helped create more than 50 years ago. And that guitar carries an extraordinary history. McKay was never simply the man standing behind Maurice White and Philip Bailey. His rhythm playing worked almost like percussion, tight, short guitar strokes fitting between Verdine White's bass, the drums and the horns. More importantly, his name appears in the writing credits of songs that became much bigger than the era that produced them. That makes what happened next even more striking. McKay left Earth, Wind and Fire in 1981. The departure came after tensions had developed during the band's enormously successful period. Larry Dunn has since spoken about disputes concerning money and the business arrangements surrounding the musicians, recalling conversations during the Faces period in which members questioned whether they were receiving a fair share of the success they were helping create. So the young guitarist who helped construct the Earth, Wind and Fire sound walked away while that sound was still everywhere. He never permanently returned to the official lineup. Yet McKay eventually built the second half of his career around preserving precisely that musical language. In 2026, this is still his job. Only weeks after turning 78, McKay was scheduled at Liverpool Philharmonic Hall on February 27th. By late May, his band was appearing at the Java Jazz Festival in Indonesia. June brought another trip to France for performances around the Fête de la Musique. McKay may have left Earth, Wind and Fire more than 4 decades ago, but he cannot really leave September. Audiences still come to hear it. They still dance to Sing a Song and the other records associated with those years. And McKay can stand there knowing that he is not merely reproducing someone else's nostalgia. His own name is written into the history of that music. And back in 1973, McKay wasn't the only guitarist helping shape that sound. That same year, Johnny Graham joined him. Graham was 22, slim, with thick curly hair and the sharp, fashionable look of the decade. While McKay supplied much of the tight rhythmic drive, Graham brought a smoother lead guitar voice, eventually leaving his own unmistakable mark on recordings such as Love's Holiday, where his solo guitar was specifically credited. By 2026, Johnny Graham was 75 years old. He looks very different from the young guitarist seen in Earth, Wind and Fire's classic photographs. His thick curls have disappeared, replaced in later images by short, graying hair. His face has become fuller and softer with age, while the youthful, sharply styled musician of the 1970s has given way to a much more understated, older man. But Graham's greatest change was not physical, it was geographical. After leaving Earth, Wind and Fire in the early 1980s, he eventually made Japan his home. That placed him thousands of miles from the American arenas where he had spent some of the most successful years of his life. His departure from Earth, Wind and Fire did not immediately end his connection with the musicians from those days. Graham later reunited with McKay in the LA All-Stars. The project also brought together other musicians associated with Earth, Wind and Fire, including saxophonist Andrew Woolfolk and drummer Fred White. For Graham, however, this never developed into the kind of high-profile second act that some of his former bandmates created. Japan became the more important chapter. There, Graham continued playing music on a smaller scale and became associated with soul sauce. It was a dramatic change from his earlier life. During Earth, Wind and Fire's peak, he had been part of enormous productions built around elaborate costumes, horn sections, choreography, and packed concert halls. In Japan, his musical activity became far more modest and removed from the international spotlight that had surrounded him during the 1970s. All of this makes Johnny Graham's life in 2026 one of the strongest contrasts within the classic lineup. The curly-haired guitarist who once recorded and toured with one of America's biggest bands eventually crossed the Pacific and built another musical life in Japan. Today, he is no longer part of Earth, Wind, and Fire's touring lineup, but put on All in All, and Johnny Graham is still there, playing the solo on Love's Holiday exactly as he did in 1977. Of course, a guitar was only one piece of that unmistakable Earth, Wind, and Fire sound. Some of its real magic was happening behind the keyboards. That was where Larry Dunn came in. When he joined Earth, Wind, and Fire in 1972, he was only 19, thin and youthful, with oversized glasses and an enormous rounded afro. He looked surprisingly young for the responsibility Maurice White placed on his shoulders. Yet Dunn helped arrange the band, became its musical director, and used synthesizers to create that unmistakable cosmic sound longtime listeners can still recognize within seconds. Today, Larry is 73, and the transformation is considerable. The enormous afro has disappeared beneath the hats he frequently wears in public. His glasses remain, but his face is fuller and older now, framed by a mustache and beard streaked with gray. Recent photographs show a man who has visibly aged, yet still carries himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who spent most of his life behind a keyboard, rather than chasing attention at the front of the stage. Away from concerts, his life has also become much more settled than the exhausting years of albums, rehearsals, and international touring with Earth, Wind, and Fire. His wife, Louisa Dunn, has shared that later chapter with him and has also been involved in the business surrounding his music. That makes Larry's life today rather different from the young musician who once had to fit himself into Maurice White's extraordinarily demanding machine. His career is now organized much more around his own projects, his own musical decisions, and the people closest to him. That independence was hard-earned. Dunn left Earth, Wind, and Fire in 1983. By then, he had already contributed far more than the keyboard's audiences could see on stage. His credits included Shining Star, Spirit, and Be Ever Wonderful, while his work as musical director helped organize the complicated mixture of horns, vocals, percussion, strings, and electronics that made the band's records sound so enormous. But leaving did not turn him into a retired former member living entirely on old stories. Instead, Larry gradually built Larry Dunn's anthology of Earth, Wind, and Fire, giving him a way to perform the catalog he helped create without returning to the current Earth, Wind, and Fire lineup. And there is an important difference there. He is no longer simply the young keyboard player helping Maurice execute a vision. Dunn now leads the musicians himself. Even his old fascination with technology survived. He continued exploring new ways of making and transmitting music, including work connected with Jacktrip Digital Bridge. The equipment became almost unrecognizable. The curiosity behind it remained remarkably familiar. That curiosity was still visible in 2026. On February 6th, Dunn appeared on Ronnie Laws's version of Ribbon in the Sky. For someone in his 70s with a catalog already filled with Grammy-winning history, recording new material was hardly necessary to prove anything. He did it because he was still working. Then came April 4th. Larry Dunn's anthology of Earth, Wind, and Fire played a sold-out show at the Canyon in Agora Hills, California. Dunn was once again behind the keyboards, surrounded by a full band and playing music that had been following him for more than half a century. For older listeners, that sight carries its own quiet shock. Many first encountered Larry when records like That's the Way of the World were new, when his huge afro and thick glasses belonged unmistakably to another America. Some of those same listeners now have grandchildren, and Larry is still sitting behind the keyboards playing the music they grew old with. His place in the industry has changed as well. On May 13, 2026, Dunn appeared at the Hollywood Walk of Fame ceremony for legendary percussionist Paulinho da Costa. He wasn't there as an emerging musician, hoping to meet the great session players anymore. After more than 5 decades in the business, Larry Dunn had become one of the veterans invited to honor them. And that may be the clearest picture of where his life stands today. The hair is gone. The face has aged. The frantic schedule of Earth, Wind, and Fire's peak years is behind him. He has a longtime partner in Louisa, his own musical organization, his own ensemble, and the freedom to choose when and how he performs. Looking back at Earth, Wind, and Fire today, it is hard not to feel how much time has passed. Maurice White is gone. Philip Bailey and Verdine White are still carrying the music forward, while Al McKay, Johnny Graham, and Larry Dunn have each followed very different paths. The young men with enormous afros, colorful stage clothes, and seemingly endless energy are now in their 70s, and the lineup that once stood together during those golden years can never truly be reunited again. So which member surprised you the most after seeing them then and now? And which Earth, Wind, and Fire song takes you back to a special time in your own life? Tell us your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey through the past and present, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories about the legendary artists and music we grew up with. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.